Good morning, ladies and gents. I thank you for taking your time to join us on this webinar. My name is Siva, and I will be your host. Without further ado, let's get started and look at what we have in store for you today. This webinar is composed of two parts, each 20 minutes long. You'll first get to hear in general as to what ISVs are ought to be doing when migrating to SaaS, as presented by Janakiraman from Aspire Systems. What follows is Peter Gerrard's inside story of the challenges faced by his service company when they built two SaaS products entirely leveraging open source software. Between part 1 and part 2, there's a poll we've arranged, and I request you all to participate in the poll and provide your responses. The last 15 minutes are reserved for your questions. Just type in your question in the question tab on your GoToWebinar toolbar anytime, either during the presentation or at the end. I will have each of your questions noted and have them posted to the panelists in the question and answer session towards the end. I'm now pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Paul Gerrard. Paul is the principal of Gerrard Consulting Limited, the host of UK Test Management Forum, and last year's winner of Eurostar European Testing Excellence Award. He has conducted consulting assignments in all aspects of software testing and quality assurance. Paul loves to present keynotes and tutorials at conferences and is also a programmer, webmaster, and a rowing coach. And we're very happy to have him co-present our webinar. His company, Gerrard Consulting, delivers services such as requirements testing, acceptance testing, and regression test automation. As pioneers of the business story method, which is a way of using structured stories to closely connect testers and developers, the company has built a tool and offers it on the SaaS platform. More on this on part 2 of our webinar. I'd like to now introduce our first speaker, Janakiraman. As practice manager of SaaS and cloud computing at Aspire Systems, Janakiraman has been pivotal in defining Aspire's vision in this segment. As a huge SaaS enthusiast himself, he fervently monitors trends in the industry through close customer interactions and industrial partnerships. A quick note about Aspire Systems. Since our inception in 1996, we have been the thought leader in outsourced product development. We have offices in India, USA, UK, Germany, and the Middle East, and cater to ISVs, small businesses, and enterprises. I would like to now hand over the control to Janakiraman for part 1 of today's webinar.
Thank you, Siva, for the introduction. And do I have the control now?
In almost just a few seconds, Janakiraman.
Sure.
Yes, you should be having control now, Janakiraman.
Okay. Okay, great. So yeah, I'll get started. Thanks again, everybody, to take time to be here in this webinar. What I'm going to share in the next 20 minutes is my experience with working with several of the ISVs towards helping them migrate to a SaaS model. And as we have been working, there are different areas, different issues that we have come across, and I've just tried to consolidate it here and try to present you that way. When you are moving to a SaaS model, these are some of the considerations that you need to have, and some thought process has to be applied in each of these areas before you jump into the SaaS transition. So to start with, we need to understand the SaaS has a bigger impact on several things, and many times one of the common pitfalls here is people think that SaaS is all about just changing the technology of the product, or probably just applying newer technologies to it, and they're done with it. So in reality, the SaaS has impact on 3 major areas. One, being the product architecture itself, which is primarily related around the technologies that you are using, the kind of the architectural changes you may have to do on the product, completely on the technology front. But there's also another area, which is the business model itself, where things like how do I price my product? Okay, I have changed it to SaaS model, but then what am I going to sell it for? And how my sales team is going to be selling it. So far, sales team has been selling it on-premise model, but now it's no more a software selling, but rather it's more of a service selling. So how am I going to bring that change? So there is a set of business aspects that also has to be equally thought about. And the last is on the operational side of it, in terms of the infrastructure, for example. So for a on-premise, you don't have to take care of the infrastructure because that is owned by the final consumer or the organization using the product. But here, you are responsible as an ISV to take care of the infrastructure as well as the issues revolving around it, and also the SLAs itself, which again is a new thing for SaaS compared to an on-premise model. So how am I going to keep track of my SLAs? How do I know that if I'm meeting those SLAs? So there is a set of things that you will have to do on the operational side to ensure that you are successful on the SaaS model. And to start with, you need to understand that the SaaS itself is a bigger paradigm shift from instead of just selling the software, it's going to be selling the service, and service includes a lot of things. One of it is the software itself, but it's also going to comprise of the support you're going to provide, the infrastructure you're going to provide, availability, security. So a lot of things come in, which we'll see in the next few slides. And the key thing is it impacts every part of your organization, and and it calls for a culture change across the company. In the sense, every single department, every single employee has to understand the impact the SaaS is bringing to the table and be able to adjust or be able to accommodate the change and be successful. And as I said, it's just not the technology part alone, but it's more than the technology, as we saw. And in some cases, people also try to struggle between the balance of maintaining the balance in an on-premise versus an on-demand version. Because once you are transitioning, you will probably want to support the on-premise version for some time before you fully switch to the SaaS model. And in some cases, people strategically decide to go on a hybrid model where you want to sell on-premise probably for large customers as well as sell the on-demand version to small and medium businesses. So how do I maintain this balance? Because it's going to take a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of cost to keep these two things going. So it calls for a finer level of planning to be sure if the strategy is right. And finally, the managing the economic value for both the ISV and customers, because SaaS, as you might be knowing, is it's a pretty tight operational thing because you don't get a huge margin, a huge cut. SaaS, you keep getting money on a recurring basis, which means you don't have upfront capital investment to play with. So it kind of has to be worked out carefully and to be able to stay profitable, at the same time be able to contribute value back to the customers and hence grow the SaaS business itself. So with that, I'll touch upon some of the key areas in an ISV, some of the key departments and some of the key challenges that one will have to look for and then have a solution in place. And I'll share some of the common practices out there to handle these challenges. On the planning front, I think some of the key important things one should remember is also to have a level of check on the feasibility of having the product and the business on SaaS model. Because there are several ISVs, several products that are out there which are serving a set of customers where the customer base involves with maintaining of confidential data, complying to a lot of security standards, and in some cases it could even be a restriction around where you can keep the data, that it has to stay within the country, or it has to stay within the premises of the end user organization. So there is a set of business feasibility one has to think through upfront and ensure that you have a solution in place, or maybe in some cases it may not even be practically feasible. If, for example, you have a software that is dealing with banking related data, the feasibility of having something outside is going to be very remote, and hence your overall success of the SaaS model itself. So you might probably want to stay away from the idea of moving to SaaS itself in those kind of circumstances. But then doing this analysis upfront is very critical. And the other aspect is related to the budget fluctuations that you can foresee. As when you can imagine, you are moving away from a one-time lump sum, receiving a lump sum from the customer, to a model where you are going to get these revenues on a month-on-month basis, which means that your entire cash flow is going to be changed, and hence you learn to plan for it. So this graph kind of gives you an idea of how the fluctuation could possibly be, where in your SaaS model you may initially not even get any revenue because you typically offer a free trial or a pilot version where you may not get any cost, but then later on as you roll out more and more modules, and again here with the SaaS, the advantage is they don't have to buy everything. They can buy module by module or feature by feature. There are various ways in which you can serve your customer base. So as you keep growing your customer, your revenues also kind of proportionately grows. But once you reach the certain threshold, you can still expect to have churns in the customer, and hence your change in the cash flow as well. So you need to be prepared to handle those set of change in the cash flow. And as we touched upon, the pricing becomes very critical. You are going to be approaching small and medium businesses, and hence pricing becomes an extremely critical factor for them to be convinced about trying the SaaS model. And some of the things you could possibly do to address it is probably doing a business and technical feasibility assessment, where in business you tend to look out these compliance issues, security issues, pricing related issues. And on the technical front, you can think about whether the product is suitable to be moved to a SaaS model. If, for example, if the product deals with a lot of exchange of data, so you need a higher bandwidth of it. So does it make sense to move to a SaaS model? Or if the application itself is not a web native application, then how do you go about doing it? So do you want to move to a web native application first and then move to a SaaS model? So there are a lot of things that can be sorted out when you do a technical feasibility assessment. And in general, from a planning perspective, it's recommended to have a shorter release cycle where Agile really helps, and that way you can take features quickly back to the customers. And it's going to be tough out there because you have your competitors also out there, and these customers are going to be continuing on a month-on-month or on a certain period basis, which means you need to keep them happy. You need to be continuing the customer satisfaction in order to retain the customer and reduce the churn. And from a sales perspective, the key important thing is to redefine the sales compensation. As I mentioned, so far it's easier to kind of offer the salespeople a certain number or a percentage of commission on the deal that they close, but here it's going to be based on the MRR, which stands for the monthly recurring revenue. So which means that the salespersons are not anymore going to get a huge sum as a percentage or their sales compensation, but instead their revenues or their compensation is also going to be aligned with the continuation of the customer or the revenue being produced by the customer. So to that extent, you will have to realign your sales compensation policy. And just throw an example out there where they talk about a case study where $1 is kind of set as a commission for MRR of 1. MRR stands for monthly recurring revenue. So which means on an early basis, out of $12, you kind of set a commission of $1, which is more or less close to 8.3%, closer to the on-premise model of a compensation model. And the other key thing is to have your sales go against the SMB market, because as you know, the SaaS model is targeted towards more of SMBs. That way, you have the volume, so that you have more volume, the SaaS becomes more profitable for you. So that way you can target the appropriate segment of people. And in case of the hybrid support, you may also want to have a clear demarcation between the customers you want to go against. So what you see here is a kind of a chart which can give you an idea of the market, the new market that you want to go against, which is huge. Compared to the previous market where you typically target the large customer segments, because the on-premise models take up a bit of initial capital expense and only large customers can afford it. But when you move to the SMB market, so it's completely a new segment that you need to approach to. And there are cases where you may want to offer both the versions of the product. In that case, you need to ensure that you have the demarcation set right between the on-premise and the on-demand model. And one key factor to consider here is sometimes the hybrid model may lead to cannibalization, because when people easily get attracted towards a SaaS model because it's less expensive, you don't have any upfront commitment, you can continue on a month-on-month or quarterly basis, compared to an on-premise model where you have to shell out upfront a set of capital expense to acquire the product and get locked into the product. So you cannot take both the solution to your customers, because then they are obviously going to choose the SaaS model. So that's where it's important to have a differentiation in the product in the form of probably additional features or more sophisticated features that could be available for the on-premise market, because for example, a drill down capability, a more dashboard related capability, those things could be possibly be kept in the on-premise version, and the SaaS version can probably be having a simpler version of it. That way, when you talk to large customers, they're able to see the clear differentiation between whether they should go for an on-premise model or for the SaaS model. On the infrastructure, as I mentioned, it's going to be one of the additional responsibilities that's going to be coming to the ISVs, and that's where they need to look for vendors like IaaS providers like Amazon or Rackspace or GoGrid, where they can kind of offload some of this infrastructure responsibility to an IaaS vendor who are much prepared to handle these things, and ensure that the SLAs are carried forwarded to the IaaS vendors. That way, your availability percentage or the backup facility, all of that should be aligned with what the IaaS provides to you, and the same you can align it to your customers as well. And the other important thing is the scalability, because in the SaaS model, you might probably get more customers at a single point in time, or you may also lose customers because of the churn. And that's where again your IaaS kind of helps you, providing you a ramp up and ramp down capability. For example, Amazon provides the elastic computing where you can increase the hardware depending on your needs. So you can either increase or decrease it. And there are also cases where you may want to support private cloud. The only thing you need to watch out for there is when you go for a private cloud, then obviously your software is going to be installed within the private cloud of the consuming organization, which means you are going to have one more copy of your software running somewhere else, and which means it's additional overhead for you. So somewhere you need to accommodate for that expenses and the overhead as well. On the support front, again, support becomes slightly a different dimension here, because you're going to have a lot of customers, compared to earlier case when you have an on-premise, your number of customers are going to be less, relatively speaking, when compared to a SaaS model. So which means you should look at avenues through which you can try to automate things, try to make it self-provisioning. That way when you have, say, 100 tenants, it shouldn't be like 100 tenants call up your support center or support person or bombard them with emails, in which case you will have to have a large support team to handle such kind of a scale, which means that you have to invest so much on support. And again, in SaaS, everything has to be optimized to be profitable. So the key is to ensure that you have enough sources which empower the customers to be able to understand the software, be able to self-provision queries, to that extent providing a lot of documentation or online materials, videos that could really help them to kind of take care of it by themselves. And the other key is the SLA tracking of it. So you need to ensure that you have a system in place to track these SLAs from the support team. And that also includes educating the support team towards taking care of the infrastructure as well as the tenant management capabilities and the configurability options. So one best practice is to build a SaaS system or enable a SaaS system with as much configurability as possible. That way when you have requests from customers, it becomes much easier to accommodate those requests. So that if there is a small change to be done in the product, it shouldn't require to go back to the development team to sit and do the change and then move it to a QA team to test it and then release it. Rather, it should be more of a support guy going to an administration portal and do the change and just save the changes, and it should be immediately reflected. Now that's much simpler and time saving and cost saving for the SaaS model. On the administration front, there are a few things again to be taken care. One is the compliances part itself, and there are a lot of varieties of compliances that each of the companies out there are using. So some of the common things involve the ISO 27001, the SaaS 70 Type 2. The good thing is some of these are also supported by the IaaS vendors themselves. So when you tie up with an IaaS vendor, just look out for these compliances as well. That way it's easier for you to support and carry forward the same to your customers. And the SaaS model also brings in the administration challenges around the billing and metering. It's about how you measure the usage of your product. And there are a lot of ways in which you may want to measure or charge your customers. Could be user-based, could be transaction-based, could be number of people managed through the product instead of people using the product. For example, if it's a work management software. So the way you may want to offer is how many people are managed through the software, while it could only be used by one person, possibly the supervisor or the administrator. But then if 20 people are being managed and planned using the software, you may want to charge for 20 users. So it calls for a separate metering procedure, and as well as the billing, which probably may happen month on month or quarterly. You need to have the right systems in place to be able to manage it. Else, what happens is as you grow along, when your number of tenants grows, these things becomes unmanageable, and you will start spending a lot of time on these activities rather than trying to make your software even better. And so the last one is on the engineering front, which is obviously has its own big area of things to be taken care. But some of the key things is about bringing the scalability, having a scalable architecture. So one point to note here is the on-premise software is by default designed to be able to support one organization, whereas in a SaaS model you are looking for the same software to be able to handle multiple organizations. Now, this is obviously going to bring in a set of changes at an architecture level, and there are different ways in which you can actually achieve it. So the thought here is to explore those options, whether to even consider PaaS as an option. Should I stick on to virtualization, or should I move to PaaS? So those are some of the things you will have to consider. Then the multi-tenancy support itself is one of the biggest discussions people used to have. While a lot of people probably want to move to multi-tenancy right away, people when transition from the on-premise to an on-demand model, many times people use the single-tenant model as a stepping stone instead of straight away getting into a multi-tenant model. But then again, it depends on your business needs. It depends on what kind of audience are you looking for, the number of customers, your budget constraints, your compliance requirements. So one has to really think through the multi-tenancy requirement before you just kind of jump into the conclusion and asking your engineering team to overhaul the product for multi-tenancy support. And the other aspect is in terms of the integration needs. One of the biggest challenges in moving from an on-premise to an on-demand is the ability of the product to retain the same level of integration that it has with the internal systems and still be able to perform from a cloud environment. That again calls for a set of technical solutions that can facilitate seamless working between these integrated systems. And from a testing perspective, the SaaS brings in a different level of testing, particularly if you are dealing with multi-tenancy. Then multi-tenancy testing itself is a big area which has to be accommodated in your test plan, as well as areas covering the non-functional requirements like the scalability itself, failover, availability. So how do I ensure that if my system is down and I have a backup running immediately and we still be able to serve the customers? So there is a set of testing that you need to accommodate in your test management plan to be able to ensure that the features that you are claiming are actually able to be supported. And the last piece of information I want to share is also about the various approaches one can take towards moving to the SaaS model, right? So there are a group of ways in which you can move. One being the virtualization option, where you take your current product as such and you try to virtualize the product, and instead of trying to bring in multi-tenancy, you take the instance as such and then you keep hosting it in each of the virtual instances. It's also called the hosted model, compared to a PaaS scenario where you kind of take your product and then you move it to either an iPaaS or an APaaS, where you can probably capitalize some of the PaaS capabilities and use them. The third option is to do a custom setup. So either you go and manually change the product to be able to bring in multi-tenancy and then be able to deliver the product. And as you could see, the reusability of the existing product obviously is going to be very high in the virtualization scenario compared to a custom scenario where you might have to probably change a lot of things. But you need to also be cautioned about that the maintenance and the operational expenses in a virtualization scenario is going to be extremely high compared to the custom or the PaaS scenario. So that's something that you need to weigh. And the virtualization offers you the capability to deliver at maturity level 1, 2, which is the single tenant model, compared to PaaS or a custom scenario where you can probably support the maturity level 3 and 4, which is where you probably be able to be operating at a high efficiency, leading to more profitability. So I think that's all I have from my side. So I'm going to hand it over back to Siva.
Thank you, Janakiraman.
Purposes within the vision that we have. So in that way, they provide a kind of medium or a channel of communication between stakeholders, testers, and developers, which is pretty significant. So we're excited about that. Now that was 2 years ago. Now we set out with those services and looked around at what tools were available to support those services, but it was quite clear that none of the existing products, whether in the testing space or the requirements management kind of space or in the agile world, and particularly the open source kind of area, which is very, very active, there was nothing available that would help us to manage the process, if you like, across in all three directions. So we decided to construct a prototype tool to, and I think I have control, which will be excellent. So we decided to construct...
Yes, Paul, you do have control now.
Okay, great stuff.
If you'd like to resume the presentation from here.
Yeah, I'm okay. So, so we started with a prototype for our own use. So the idea was to create a simple product to allow us to capture stories, to cross-refer to requirements, to look at reusing those stories as the basis of acceptance tests, and also as a feeder into behavior-driven and test-driven approaches in the Agile world. So we made a start on this, and we had some working software which is very, very, very basic. But the more we got into it, the more we learned that we thought, actually, as a product that would support us in our service offerings, it could work quite nicely. But actually, why are we stopping there? The product itself has value in its own right. So we didn't plan at all to construct a software as a service product. We kind of drifted into it. So Janaki's presentation earlier on sort of set out a very systematic approach covering many, many bases. We didn't start from that position. We kind of drifted into it and encountered challenges as we proceeded. And so probably my list is similar to Janaki's list, except that we encountered these problems almost by accident, and certainly not without a lot of forethought. However, the challenge then was, okay, if we're going to set about building a product that we perhaps can exploit as a commercial product, what are the considerations that are what were the first sort of challenges that we had to get over? Well, the first one was we're a service company. We're not a product company. So as consultants, we'd worked with many service and product companies in the past. We'd worked a lot of the time in financial institutions and banks and the usual places. But we'd done a certain amount of consulting in product companies, and my business partner Susan had a background as a product company in a past life, so we had some expertise. And fortunately, our non-exec chair also had been financial controller of a product company, so we had some experience, and we did know somewhat what we were doing. But it was a complete change of direction for us. On the technical front, we had experience of maintaining and hosting websites and content management systems, and we built some very small-scale software products, in particular an online training course, a facility that we offer certified training over. And we built some other small-scale 20 to 30 screen applications for kind of private use, but nothing that we'd sold, and nothing that was substantial or scalable, or that we would think of marketing in a commercial way. So the challenge for us was how we transitioned the business from services to software as a service. And part of that transition was we felt very strongly and very early that we didn't, we'd been using proprietary software and obviously the Microsoft tool set for many, many years, and all our experience was in the Microsoft world. But we sensed that if we were to exploit our skill set in an effective way, we kind of wanted to move away from a proprietary model, partly because of cost, and partly because it seems to be, the open source community seems to be making very strong progress in all directions, certainly in the infrastructure space, but also in the software development and product support space. So we took this very seriously, and we thought very early on that we would embark on an open source platform. However, although we understood the risks of doing this in terms of the technical risks, being a software testing company, we knew we've got a strong track record of non-functional testing and functional testing and performance and security, and we have that background. We've never done product management, and so that's probably our weakest area. So from that, we had to sort of resource platform. So I can show you the product in a second that we use, but It's basically a LAMP, a Linux, Apache, MySQL, and Python platform. And we wanted to adopt some kind of development framework to sit upon that. Now, Python was the choice for several reasons, and it's partly a philosophical reason, but we chose a framework called Web2Py, which uses the Python language and is amenable to supporting MySQL databases and many others, but also has a concept of services built in that we fully expected that part of what we would offer would be services to extract and import and interface to other products. So the concept of services was a very strong requirement from that point of view. So Web2Py was the product we chose in the end. This is a list of the products. I think there's, I think that's complete. I think there's just one missing, a jQuery. But you can see that the kind of products we're using are fairly standard. So Ubuntu, Linux, MySQL, Python, of course. Web2Py is the framework. But on top of that, there are some development libraries which we've also used. So for graphing and plotting, graphical presentation of data, we use a library called Matplotlib. Very well established, been around for many, many years, used extensively in scientific environments, so very rock solid product, if you like. Others, like jQuery, which doesn't appear on the screen, I'm afraid, but jQuery is a JavaScript library, and jQuery is a very popular and powerful mechanism for managing in-browser manipulation of the document object model, the DOM, and the content that's the presentation layer. So with that, and JQGrid, which is a way of presenting tabular data in a sophisticated way with filtering and sorting and selection and stuff like that. This was the kind of the range of kind of tools that we use. We also have a built-in internet relay chat server, which is not used very much, but is there in the background as a piece of infrastructure that we will roll out in the future as part of our roadmap. So our perception of the open source world was that the infrastructure products are reliable. So Apache, MySQL seem to be rock solid, used on many, many, many environments. The development libraries were the challenge from our point of view, because the things we wanted to do, there are many product choices that can be made, and it's kind of the combination that is the power of open source, not the products alone. And to shortcut the kind of the discussion that we could have would be, in some examples it was, we need an HTML editor to drop into our web forms, so we went looking for HTML editors. On the other hand, and that was one kind of approach which came to pass, and the other angle was where in our research we'd encounter interesting software products that we thought, oh, we could make use of that, not necessarily now but in the future, and it fits nicely. So for example, the JQGrid was not our first choice option. So sometimes it was a technology driven, sometimes it was problem driven, and kind of the mentality and the attitude you have to have is you have to download these products, try them out, see how they fit the way you want to work, take a good look at the way these products are supported and the community that supports them, and how responsive they are, because quite a lot of open source products actually are dead, and the developers have walked away and they are not supported anymore. So these are probably not safe options. At the end of the day, the responsibility for reporting problems is yours. So in that respect, it's no different from proprietary. And there's at one level, proprietary and open source are the same, except you don't have a commercial lever to wield against your proprietary suppliers. And having said that, most proprietary suppliers, if you are one of many thousands of customers, you don't have much power anyway. So I don't think there's such a big difference between open source and proprietary nowadays. So anyway, the technical risks that we saw straight away were, how quickly can we deploy this product? Because one of the ways, by product deployment, it's partly establishing a new server environment with the product upon it. So our architecture is such that it can be deployed as an appliance, a virtual appliance, with all the functionality embedded within that appliance. Or we can split it across multiple pieces of hardware from the point of view of the web server, Internet Relay chat servers, mail server, and database, of course. So speed of deployment was quite an issue for us. Performance, scalability, obviously, security, protecting customers' data, reliability, the usual things. The challenge for us was, although we're going to obviously start with a limited rollout, so we're not going to have 1,000 customers on day one, if we are successful, we have to have a position and say, as and when the traffic increases, we need to be ready to scale. So although we haven't scaled dramatically yet, because we've only launched about a month ago, we know we will have to do that, and we have things in readiness for that. So kind of quickly to go through some of the other challenges, I think when it comes up. I'm clicking, but nothing's happening. Ah, there we go. Right. So deployments. We have. I need to be patient. There we go. So deployment. So a full deployment of all the software, the database, the starting data, we can deploy in about 75 minutes. Now, of course, we don't do many deployments, but to have a rapid deployment process allows us to be ready with hot standby machines very quickly indeed. So a rapid deployment is our initial approach to having a hot standby service. Every client, although they're all sharing initially one platform, they all have their own dedicated database. Now this causes some administrative problems at our end, but in the longer run it's a better approach, because we do expect clients to grow and evolve with the product, and at some point to want to extract their data perhaps to a dedicated machine, or perhaps to bring it on site, on their own site with a virtual appliance. So the challenge for us is partly to have rapid deployments, but also to integrate the procedures for setting up new clients, new tenants, if you like. So integration of existing procedures is something we have in our roadmap. Performance scalability, we're very confident that the hardware we're using can support 100 users quite easily. We haven't, I have to say, run a performance test of hundreds or thousands of users yet, but we plan to do that next month, and we have some plans in place to do just that. But the principle is that if we do have pressure on hardware to scale, we can scale horizontally. That is, we know we can duplicate web servers and database servers and provide a service to a smaller number of people on very many machines. It's not limited in that respect. So whether these machines are physical pieces of hardware or virtual or in our private cloud or in a public cloud, to us isn't a problem. We're aware of this. Corporates, given the nature of the data that's being captured, are likely to wish to have their own on-site system, because they may choose not to share their data on public sites. We are prepared for that, and we are offering virtual appliances to do that. So although we're offering software as a service and we're not licensing the software itself, we will provide appliances and license those appliances. So that's the approach we're taking. In terms of security, some technical stuff really is like use secure HTTP across the piece, so all the transactions, all the access to the sites are in this way. We use a software firewall at the moment, and access to those machines is through secure shells. So we have a fairly basic setup, but we do understand and recognize that our roadmap says that we will have load balanced redundant servers with a more sophisticated firewall arrangement as well. All behind, and everything that behind those firewalls will be, today, their physical hardware. We have a migration path to a private cloud, but if it gets beyond our capability, we fully expect to move into a public cloud. So it's driven by the demand and also the nature of the software development that's going to have to happen. So part of what we're doing is we're evolving the software month by month, and that is the other driver that will force us down one direction or another. Most clients will want copies of their own data, perhaps to close down the service and take it away, or perhaps to migrate it to another environment, or perhaps for reporting. So part of the service has to be the ability to export and access data, and we'll do this through the application itself and the Web2Pi product, but also give people access to backups of their data from MySQL and all their uploaded files as well. In terms of reliability, our experience, and we've been hosting websites, I think, for 7 years. We've never had, touch wood, we've never had a hardware failure in all those years. Through our ISP, we've had an occasional network outage, but by and large, these are very quickly recovered by the ISP themselves. So, although we've had application bugs, it's definitely our fault. The infrastructure that we've been running for the past, I think, 7 years, most of our servers have been up for, the oldest ones have been up for 7 years, and they're being decommissioned fairly steadily now, and we're not using those on the new service. But our experience has been very good reliability, so I guess our perception of risk isn't so high. However, we have taken precautions, and we have a complete mirror environment for all the services out there. In terms of the cost of the service to tenants, to customers, is we're pitching the service very low, but we aim to make commercial progress through selling the service of the tool, but for corporates and larger customers, we will sell consulting services in parallel. So our expectation is, because this involves a new change, although the tool itself does not generate high revenues, because we're focusing it on corporates, we will sell services and consulting services in parallel. So we have this strange mix of both services and software as a service. Okay, future challenges, yes, of course, we need 24-hour support when we sell across the globe. Right now, we're not doing that, but that's obviously on our roadmap. Deploying software and infrastructure changes is something that we know we have to be more sophisticated with. Right now, we don't have to be, because our user base is fairly small. We're just starting out. We're just on this journey. And there's all the exciting things to do with social media and the Facebooks and blogging and LinkedIn too. We know we have to connect to these things. But right now, our next step will be to build up our development and support teams to grow, to cope with the growth that we anticipate. Pretty much that's it. So I'm happy to hand over to Siv now.
Thank you very much, Paul. We've received a few questions now from the audience. The first one, this is to both Paul, you, and Janaki. First question being, how are SaaS companies measuring their scalability? What is the best metric you're seeing for measuring scalability?
Janaki?
Sure. So, yeah. So, I think that's a very good question, because as I mentioned, scalability becomes one of the toughest challenges for the SaaS companies. So there is no a hardcore metric for that, but what would be a more useful way to measure it is how quickly are you able to onboard new customers, and what is the cost that you are incurring for onboarding new customers. So as I mentioned, when you have a well-architected solution, then you should be able to onboard customers on the fly without having further expense on hardware or for support or from development team. Rather, the product should be capable enough of provisioning or allowing the administrators to create new tenants on the fly, be able to provision instances for them, and get them rolling on the fly. So I would measure it probably in the way of what is the amount of time and cost spent for onboarding these customers, and that will indirectly reflect to you in terms of how scalable is the current system you have in place.
I think from taking a different direction from the point of view of usage is once you have some usage history, you know approximately what the behavior of your tenants are. So, on a server that supports, say, 100 concurrent users, your application logs and your web server logs and other instrumentation I'm sure that you'd have, you can then take a view on what a typical load is. Now, when you have that knowledge, you can then use that content, those load profiles, to drive performance tests on other hardware and scale the load up proportionally, and take that performance test data as your metric of how scalable your technology is. Now, it could well be that. So from our point of view, if we have big servers, so we can take on 5 users here, 10 users there, small teams, whatever. But if a client comes along and says, well, we want to make a corporate decision and put 20,000 on, I couldn't possibly predict whether our hardware would take that load. However, part of our service would be, well, this is a major implementation, so obviously the consulting services then come into play, and we would plan and execute a performance test which would satisfy the client that we can support the loads that they might impose on us. So I think partly it's about monitoring existing logs, but it's partly about being prepared, and it's almost certain that you have to do this once you scale, that you have to do some performance testing, some benchmarking of your hardware solution, your technical architecture. Having said all that, having got a performance test in place, you can then also use that performance capability to look at security issues, reliability, different failure modes, and so on, and your backup and recovery processes too. So there's a real value in having a performance test, an automated test capability.
Okay, thank you, Paul, and thank you, Janaki. Our next question. What % of SaaS companies you have interacted so far had distributed data on data centers throughout the world? This question is for you, Janaki.
Sure, Shiva. I mean, to take the exact scenario that you are mentioning, honestly speaking, there aren't many that require such a kind of a distributed kind of a scenario. So I'd probably say anywhere between 10 to 15% of the cases is where it is even applicable. And for the other cases, the scenario is more in terms of not exactly data in terms of distribution, but more in terms of disaster recovery and more in terms of backup. The same scenario holds good because you don't want to kind of have all your data and system in one particular location. Instead, you may want to replicate them and make them available in case of the event of any disaster. I think that's also an equally common scenario that we encounter, and that's like almost like 50% of the cases we are seeing that kind of a need being there.
Thank you very much, Janaki. And the next question is for Paul. Paul, if you have no idea of how your solution performance will scale with demand, how were you able to create a compelling business case?
Well, I think you have to, in order to create a compelling business case, I think like the positive side of the business case is the benefit and value of what you're offering. So that's not the question. But let's say you have the big plus on one side of the equation and say, well, this is the benefit of implementing this solution. On the negative side, you have the actual costs, but also the risks of the deployment and the risks of operation. So the way I would treat that is one way is to do very serious studies and performance testing and risk analyses and workshops and all that other good stuff. Another one would be to say, well, let's step back. If we are working in an unknown domain, the best you can do is to look at a limited rollout, maybe of a department or a division or a small team, and then use the knowledge gained through that exercise to then say, well, let us speculate ahead how we would scale this solution. I think from my point of view, I'm less able to talk about very large, although we've tested and consulted on large systems, ours is not intended to be a very large deployment. So 100 users would be, for us, a large deployment. Okay, so if a corporation, global, came to us and said we want to roll this out to 30,000 people, that would be very exciting for us, of course. But I've no doubt we would have to come up with a very solid case for how we would support that number of users. And of course, a corporate would say, well, and we expect your recovery and resilience and security and all these other measures to be in place. So partly that, I think, for us, that would be a significant piece of work that we would have to offer as a supplier, but also we'd have to offer an implementation service in parallel with that. And there's probably a negotiation to be had to say, well, if you are going to go down the path of 30,000 people, the biggest problem you've got isn't the technology, it's the changing working practices for your 30,000 people. So to me, the bigger risk is not the technology. Most technology problems can be solved, with care and attention. The bigger challenge from the client's point of view is their ability to roll out a new way of working across a large organization. And so I think all I'm trying to say is if it's a very large implementation and a business case of some substance has to be created, that's a major piece of work. If it's a smaller scale thing, I think you have to to have a reference site. So if a client approaches us and says, well, how will you deal with a 100 user implementation, we'd have to say, well, here's a reference company who are doing exactly that right now. And I think it's one of these things that in the early days it's very hard to show reference sites, and you have to do it, of course. But as you mature and grow, one would hope that you have reference sites that you can point at and say, this customer of ours is doing very similar to what you're intending to do, so we can support your functional requirements and non-functional requirements. It's not a simple question. It's not a simple answer, I'm afraid.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. I do have a few more questions, interesting ones here, but due to want of time, I'll have to send it to you offline and have those questions answered and sent out to our audience. I thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for taking part in this webinar. We would meet soon on a possible future webinar. I wish you a good day, and I wish to convey my sincerest thanks to Janakiraman, our panelist, and our guest presenter, Paul Gerrard. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Siva. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.